Mashiach ben David. I'm not sure if you noticed, and I forgot to mention earlier, but this evening, the Seder D'Shmaya is being recorded. So you can see these two little big mics on the sides of the stage. And it's taking all of you in because that's the only way I decided to make another album. So the chaver with me, enough of my only my voice.
A good Vok, Shavua Tov. That was Shlomo Katz on his album Live in Melbourne, talking in the middle of his song Eliyahu Hanavi about the fact that they were recording that concert, which became the album Live in Melbourne. Eliyahu Hanavi is his song, his melody for a tune that we sing on Saturday nights as we welcome the new week after making the Havdalah ceremony. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Let's light up the darkness with a new wisdom candle to open a new week. We have one of those lovely accidents. There's no accidents. Accidents are just messages from the Almighty. But so nice now that we are studying the laws of Yom Kippur and the whole elaborate, beautiful choreography through this tractate, Yoma, the 6th volume of the Talmud, which contains the laws of Yom Kippur. And tonight we're actually on Daf Vav, page 6. But this whole tractate that has about 88 pages, so we'll be in it for almost 3 months. But hey, that's just 1/4 of the year, and the odds were against the fact that we would be studying the laws of Yom Kippur at the time that the Parsha, the Torah portion, is covering these very same laws that we are studying. And the new week's Torah portion, Acharei Mos, Acharei Mos, after the death, meaning after the death of Aaron's sons. And then God gives the laws of Yom Kippur, right? So there was the inauguration, which we've been talking a lot about, when Aaron first became the high priest and his sons were invested as the priests. And then tragically, 2 of his sons, Nadav and Avihu, almost intoxicated with the proximity and the presence of the Lord, drew too close. The Torah says they brought an alien fire into the forbidden place, and their souls fled from their bodies. And Aaron was not able to mourn because the anointing oil was upon him. He was serving in his role as the high priest. That all happened actually several Torah portions ago in Shmini. But this week's, the coming week's Torah portion includes all of the relevant laws that we are studying here in our journey through Yoma. It doesn't say, of course, that the priest is sequestered for a week before Yom Kippur. We've been talking about where that's derived from. But the fact that he brings his own offerings, a bull and I believe a ram, and the 2 goats, and that he enters into the Holy of Holies with the incense, and he brings the offerings of the nation, and he lays his hands on 2 goats. One is shechted and slaughtered and offered up within the temple. The other one is sent out to Azazel, meaning a mountain, out into the wilderness and bearing the sins of the people. And from this comes the whole concept of the scapegoat, which has entered the culture for all cultures. Etc. These laws are all contained in this week's Torah portion, just at the time that we are studying the laws in Tractate Yoma. A nice confluence, as it were, of teachings. Tonight's episode of AT Daily, and I forget exactly what number we're on, but we're approaching number 500. I think we got a little ways to go. I think we're about 470, something like that, or approaching 470. But tonight's episode of AT Daily is sponsored by Sharon Frant Brooks, and she's dedicating tonight's class to her father. This is a beautiful dedication. She's dedicating the class to her father, Milton Frant, Hebrew name Michael David ben Yecheskel. on tonight, Saturday, to commemorate his 5th yahrzeit. So this is the 5th anniversary of his transition from this world to the world of souls. And Sharon writes that her father was born in the shtetl in Poland. He got here to America in the mid-30s, and he fought in the U.S. Army Air Corps in World War II in the South Pacific, flying over 52 combat missions and earning the Air Medal from the U.S. Army. His love of Jewish learning was extensive, and it began in his cheder class, his elementary school class, in Dubiecko, Poland. He is missed greatly by both family and community. We honor him tonight. We pray that the merit of our learning tonight will accrue to his merit in the world of souls. May his soul have a great aliyah, a great elevation in that world, and we say amen. Let me close that. And Sharon, may you and all your loved ones be blessed with unlimited blessings from above, with health, with joy, with meaning, with livelihood, with all good things. May you only hear good news. We thank you for sponsoring tonight's class, and we all say amen to the wish for your blessings. Who is with us tonight as we open a new week with some beautiful learning here in Tractate Yoma? Bill from Berkeley, and in Merced, Sharon in Lebanon, New Jersey. I'm glad you're with us, Sharon, to hear that dedication. Paula in the Great Northwest. Ken regards, I'm sure I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but Ken Schultz-Rabin is wishing us regards from Joensuu in Finland. Wow, we have 2 people listening in Finland, Ken and Helena. Paula in Chicago. Farah is with us from Pakistan. Great to see you, Farah. Steve in Oregon. Barbara in Tennessee. Lou in Modi'in, that's Israel. Lindsay in Cincinnati, I know. Miriam wishing us Shavua Tov. And John is excited like I am for Finland and Pakistan in the house. Janice is saying amen. Linda says she always has hope here. Amen and amen from Farah. Over there, let me see, on the YouTube side. Tamiro is with us from Addis, I guess, from Addis Ababa, did they say, or just Addis? In Ethiopia. Wow, so we are very international tonight. Welcome, everybody. Good to be learning with you. So we're still discussing the first Mishnah here in Tractate Yoma. And this Mishnah concerns the sequestering of the high priest prior to Yom Kippur, sequestering him for a full week. And they, as the Mishnah says, we remove him from his house. And that doesn't just mean from his home, that he's not living in his house. He's living on the Temple Mount itself, on the Temple compound. But also we separate him from his wife. And that's what we're going to be discussing tonight. So the source for the separation, as we've seen, is a debate between Rabbi Yochanan, who says that, well, just as the first high priest, Aaron, was sequestered in the tabernacle for 7 days prior to being inaugurated, the tabernacle being inaugurated and the high priest being inaugurated, and the beginning of the offerings being brought, and that center of Judaism, which would then function in that role for the next 1,200 years between the tabernacle, the first temple, and the second temple. That the original high priest was sequestered for 7 days, and since there are reasons to tie Yom Kippur to the inauguration, we separate him for 7 days. And it was Reish Lakish who disagrees and says, no, actually, the reason we separate sequester the high priest for these 7 days is because Moses was sequestered on Mount Sinai prior to entering the divine presence itself and receiving the Torah. And since the high priest will have this encounter with the divine presence on Yom Kippur when he enters the Holy of Holies, the only one who's allowed to do so, to walk through the curtain, and be in the Holy of Holies, where the divine presence rests over the Ark of the Covenant, as it did in the days of the tabernacle and the first temple. not the second temple, since by then the Ark of the Covenant had been hidden. Nevertheless, as Moses prepared to enter the divine presence by being sequestered, so the high priest should be sequestered. We've been in the midst of that debate for quite a while. Now we're addressing a slightly different question, which is, okay, we understand why he needs to be sequestered in the Temple Mount, as it were, right, to be prepared for that meeting. But why does he have to be separated from his house, which is a euphemism for his wife? Why does he have to be separated from his wife? Why couldn't, for example, his wife quarantine with him, right? Why couldn't they be a pod, as it were, on the Temple Mount? And this is the question we're going to be addressing tonight. Let me just check this. Okay. So after a long digression in which we discussed many peripheral issues, the Gemara returns to interpreting the Mishnah itself, this first Mishnah in Tractate Yoma. It was taught in the Mishnah, the sages would remove the high priest from the house to the chamber of the Parhedron. And the Gemara asks, why do the sages remove him? Let me just make a quick adjustment here. Yeah, that's what's going on. My computer had just started to do an automatic backup, and that was interfering with my ability to monitor this broadcast. Okay. So why do the sages remove him? By the way, tonight's page, let me just mention, tonight's page is short, so we're going to cover the whole daf. We're just going to do the whole daf. And that, I usually skip around so that I have time to sort of delve into some parts a little bit more deeply, or, to skip stuff that might be a little bit too technical. But sometimes it's good to just do the whole page, and so we really see the rhythm of it, the way you would encounter in a standard Daf Yomi class, as it were, where they just cover every bit of the page. So we'll be doing that tonight. Tomorrow night, no class. It's our Sunday night regular time. We won't be having a class because I'm going to be involved in an all-day training for the volunteer security force that I serve on here in Los Angeles. So the plan is to continue at the regular time on Monday, 6 p.m. Pacific, and to do a double page that day. Both of these pages are pretty short, the ones which follow, pages 7 and 8, so we should be able to do the double on Monday and get back on schedule. Okay, so why do the sages remove him? Well, the Gemara asks in astonishment, why do the sages remove him? It is as we stated above. Whether it is according to Rabbi Yochanan, as per his opinion, that we derive sequestering from the sequestering of the high priest prior to the inauguration, or whether it is according to Reish Lakish, as per his opinion, that we learn sequestering from the way Moses was sequestered before encountering the divine presence, either way, we must sequester. And the Gemara explains its questions. This is what the Gemara is saying. Why did he withdraw from his house, i.e. from his wife? And the Gemara explained why he must be removed to a special location, but why doesn't his wife join him? It was taught in a Baraisa. Rabbi Yehuda ben Beteira says, it is due to the concern lest his wife be found to be in a situation of uncertainty as to whether or not she has the halachic status of a nida, a woman experiencing her menses. And he will have relations with her and become impure. And the Gemara asks in astonishment, is this to say that we are dealing with wicked people? It's an absolute prohibition, in the Torah for a man and a woman to cohabit when she is having her menses. They are prohibited to, husband and wife are prohibited to each other during the time of her menses. This is the high priest of Israel preparing for Yom Kippur. Why on earth would we suspect that he would not be able to overcome, his urge to be with his wife if she was having the time of her menses? Are these wicked people? Rather, rephrase the statement. It is due to the concern lest he have relations with his wife and then she be found to be in a situation of uncertainty as to whether or not she has the halakhic status of a nida, a menstruating woman. In a case where blood is found on the sheets after the couple engaged in relations and there is uncertainty as to whether or not the high priest cohabited with his wife while she had the halachic status of a nida, the status of the high priest is one of uncertain impurity, right? So the idea is, obviously, if she was on her schedule, they wouldn't go near each other. They would make sure. But sometimes, a woman has spotting at other times of the month. And if after they were together, they found some evidence of that, so then there would be the possibility, they didn't do it on purpose, but unwittingly they were together when she was a nida. In that case, he would attain that tuma. He would have tuma. He would be ritually impure. And then how could he serve as the high priest on Yom Kippur? This is the issue that is now being discussed. And the sages stated the following assumption before Rav Chisda. In accordance with whose opinion is that a reason for concern? It is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who said a nida who found evidence on the sheets within 24 hours after having relations, creating an uncertainty with regard to her status when she engaged in the relations, renders the man who was with her retroactively tameh, ritually impure, as if it were in accordance with because that's the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. The opinion of the rabbis, according to the opinion of the rabbis, we wouldn't have an issue here. Why? Because as it were, if this problem were in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, it wouldn't make sense. Because didn't the rabbis say that a woman with regard to whom there is uncertainty as to whether or not she has the legal status of a nida does not render the man who had relations with her retroactively tameh. Therefore, the high priest need not leave his wife during the week prior to Yom Kippur. Rav Chisda said to the sages, even if you say that the Mishna is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis who disagree with Rabbi Akiva, the rabbis disagree with Rabbi Akiva only with regard to this retroactive impurity in a case where the evidence on the sheets was discovered long afterwards, after there was time for the woman to leave the bed and bathe, and only then discover that she had spotted. Due to the time that elapsed, the rabbis hold that there is no way to prove a connection between when the woman had this spotting and when she and her husband engaged in relations. However, if the blood spotting was found merely afterward, like right afterward, well, then the rabbis would concede to Rabbi Akiva that she renders the man retroactively impure. I mean, if she spots immediately after they were together, then there's good reason to think that she may have been spotting even while they were together. So she's tameh and she renders him tameh. Rabbi Zera said, learn from it that one who is tameh because he had relations with a nida is unlike a nida in terms of the time of immersion. Right? So now what we're going to say is, so if a woman is a nida, so the normal thing is she waits until she's no longer spotting. Then she waits 7 days and counts clean days. And then that night, after the 7th day, she goes to the mikveh, immerses, and then she's ritually pure, and the husband and wife would be permitted to each other again. But the husband, because he's sort of 1 degree removed, so even though he contracts tuma from her because they were together, he can actually immerse on the 7th day. He doesn't have to wait until the night after the 7th day. And we're learning actually from this law that they only require the priest to be separated for 7 days, that it must be that even if it turns out that he and his wife were together before they took him out of his house and sequestered him in the Temple Mount, so maybe they had relations, kind of like a goodbye, honey, I'll see you in a week after Yom Kippur. So maybe they had relations before he left. And then, like, they put him in the temple and she found out, oh, wait a minute, I'm sorry, the unexpected spotting. It wouldn't matter because he's got a 7-day sequestering period, so he could immerse on the 7th day, and then he would be ready for Yom Kippur when it begins that night, the night after his 7 days of sequestering. As if you say that one who is impure, tameh, because he had relations with a nida, is like the nida herself in terms of the time of immersion. When does he immerse? In that case, he could only immerse at night after the 7 complete days. And since that night is Yom Kippur, how can he perform the Yom Kippur service the next day, right? If it was true that he would have to wait like her until after the 7 days were complete and immerse, as it were, on the 8th night, then he wouldn't be ready for Yom Kippur. They would have had to require an 8-day sequestering, but they don't require an 8-day sequestering. They only require 7 days. So this proves that he can immerse on the 7th day, whereas she needs to wait until the night after the 7th day, because that's just the law of the Nida. And so rather, we must conclude that since it is only 7 days of sequestering, that one who has relations with a Nida is not like the Nida herself in terms of when he is permitted to immerse after the 7 days of purification. Rav Shimi from Nehardea says, even if you say that one who is tameh, ritually impure, because he had relations with a Nida, is like a Nida with regard to the time of immersion, the high priest is still not removed from his house at night. Rather, we sequester him 1 hour. So now what they're saying is, well, actually what they do is they sequester him 1 hour before what would become the 7-day period. And that's why, even if the law is that one who cohabits with a Nida has the same time of immersion as the Nida herself, meaning after 7 clean days, then immerse that night, it would still be okay for the high priest, because they bring him out of the house and sequester him on the Temple Mount 1 hour before sunset and then count 7 days. So in a sense, that 7th day is like the 8th day. This is the teaching of Rav Shimi. But the Gemara raises an objection to the opinion that one who is tameh because he had relations with a Nida, that he immerses at night. Why? Because with regard to all those obligated in immersions, all those who are obligated to immerse in a mikvah for some kind of purification, their immersion is during the day. And the only exceptions to this, meaning everybody who's purifying from something, whether it's from the monthly menses, or because they had an emission, or because they came into contact with the carcass of a creeping thing, a sheretz, or because they assisted in burying a dead person. They went to the funeral and they touched the dead body and they have corpse tuma. All these people require immersion in a mikvah, in a ritual bath. And for all of them, the immersion happens during the day. And the only exception to that is a Nida, a woman who has menstruated, and a woman after childbirth. Only these two cases, the immersion is at night. Everyone else is during the day. So how can you say that the man and the woman who unwittingly had relations together when it turned out later that she was having her menses or was spotting, that she will have to wait until nighttime to immerse, but you can't say that he will have to wait until nighttime to immerse, because we have this solid teaching that all immersions are during the day, except for the Nida and the woman after childbirth. Right. And so the Gemara rejects that proof, because the term Nida in that baraisa includes the woman and everyone whose inclusion in the impurity is derived from her status. So it might be that, okay, well, this man is not a Nida, but he became tameh because he had relations with a Nida, so maybe he does have to make his immersion at night after the 7 days. But the Gemara raises another objection. The halachic status, the legal status of one who is tameh due to a seminal emission, like a nighttime emission, or to a man's emission, is like that of one who came into contact with a sheretz, one who came into contact with the carcass of a creeping thing. Whereas, it could be a mouse, it's defined which are the creeping things that impart tuma. Whereas the legal status of one who is ritually impure, tameh, because he had relations with a Nida, is like that of one who became tameh with the ritual impurity imparted of a corpse, right? That somehow having relations with a Nida is similar to touching a dead body, like you would when you were, assisting in a funeral. So the Gemara asks, does the Baraisa not mean that one who had relations with a Nida is like one who became tameh by touching a corpse in terms of the mikvah, which he may perform during the day? No, the Gemara rejects that conclusion. The Baraisa is merely comparing the duration of their impurity. It's not that there's some kind of spiritual equivalency with these kinds of ritual impurity. It's just the actual technical details of how long that tuma lasts and how you go through a purification process. One who experiences a seminal emission is tameh, ritually impure, for 1 day, like one who came into contact with a sheretz. One who has relations with a nida is impure for 7 days, like one who became tameh by coming into contact with a corpse. And the Gemara wonders, for what purpose would the Baraisa come to teach the duration of their impurity? The Torah explicitly writes the durations of their impurity. Why do we need to derive any kind of a teaching about that when it's written explicitly in the Torah how long the tuma lasts? This, the one impure by virtue of coming into contact with the corpse, has an impurity for 7 days written in his regard. And similarly, that one who is impure because he had relations with a nida has an impurity of 7 days written in his regard. There's no need for a baraisa to derive a matter that is explicitly written in the Torah from another matter written explicitly in the Torah. Rather, must it not be that the baraisa this teaching is equating them with regard to their immersion, in that both one who has relations with a nida and one impure with the impurity of a corpse, both of them immerse during the day. They don't have to wait until night. But the Gemara rejects this logic. No, actually, the Baraisa is referring to the duration of their tuma. And although there is nothing novel in that equation, it was necessary for the rabbi to teach the latter clause of the Baraisa. However, in one sense, the case of one who is impure because he had relations with a nida is more severe than one impure with the impurity imparted by a corpse. One who is impure because he had relations with a nida transmits his tuma through lying on a bed or sitting on a chair. This is part of the law. And we just had this in last week's Torah portion. And so, the different kinds of ritual impurity have different, they can transmit in different ways. The laws are different about them in terms of the way you contracted this tuma, this ritual impurity. It depends in what ways you can then transmit it to another, or, for example, to touch holy foods, which then become disqualified and can no longer be eaten by a priest because they're disqualified. Teruma, which is a sacred food that only priests can eat. If somebody who is ritually impure, tameh, touches it under certain conditions, then it becomes disqualified and the priest can no longer eat it. So one who is impure because he had relations with a nida transmits this tuma through sitting on a bed or lying on a bed or sitting on a chair, even if he never came into direct contact with the chair or the bed. There could be like 10, this is like the Princess and the Pea. There could be 10 mattresses on top of the bed, and if somebody who is a nida or had relations with a nida sits on this bed, then even the bed all the way at the bottom will receive this ritual impurity. He confers upon them the first degree ritual impurity status, sufficient only to render foods and liquids impure. One impure with impurity imparted by a corpse transmits impurity by means of direct contact, right? So one who touches a corpse, in order to render things impure, he has to touch them directly. One who has relations with a nida can actually make an indirect transmission that would render these foods impure. Come in here an additional proof that Rabbi Chia taught. For the Zav and the Zava and the leper and the female leper, right? So a Zav and a Zava are people who have certain kinds of bodily secretions that also make them tameh, that has nothing to do with the menses or with having sex. These are something else. And the leper and the female leper, this is the mitzora, right? So this is, we've been talking about this. It's not the modern kind of leprosy. This is the physical manifestation of a spiritual malady where you've engaged in something like lashon hara, speaking, trading and gossip about other people, and eventually it catches up with you. We don't have this condition anymore. Our spiritual state as a nation is actually so degraded that we don't have the blessing of having our skin break out when we've lowered our spiritual status by engaging in gossip. So this has been done away with, and we don't have the purification process either since the temple was destroyed. However, we learn the lesson of how dangerous gossip is. At any rate, for the Zav and the Zava, the leper and the female leper, and one who had relations with a Nida, and one who is Tameh by virtue of touching a corpse, their immersion is during the day. But for the Nida herself and a woman after childbirth, their immersion in the mikveh is at night. Period. Direct teaching. And the Gemara concludes that this Baraisa is indeed a conclusive refutation of the opinion of Rav Shima from Nehardea, who said that one who is impure because he had relations with a Nida immerses at night. Therefore, we have to separate the high priest from his wife, but that 7-day separation is enough to ensure that even if they cohabited right before he left his house, before beginning his 7-day sequestering in the temple, and then it turned out that unbeknownst to her, she spotted afterwards, and she might have been, Anita at the time that they had relations, he still has enough time to be sequestered, to immerse on the 7th day, and he'll be ready to perform his obligations on Yom Kippur night. Now, with regard to the sequestering of the high priest, the Gemara asks, and before you remove him from the potential of impurity of his house, remove him from the potential of the more severe impurity imparted by a corpse. The sages should have instituted an ordinance prohibiting visitors to the high priest while he's sequestered in the temple, lest one die while in his chamber and render him impure. Since we're going to the trouble to have all, right, we're sequestering for 7 days on the Temple Mount. That, we're not sure exactly why. It might be because it happened for the first inauguration of the first high priest, there was a 7-day sequestering, or because Moses prepared to meet the divine presence in a similar way. That's why he's sequestered. Now we're saying, well, we don't allow him to be with his wife during that 7-day period, lest, they make a mistake and he become ritually impure by having relations with Anita. So now that we're being ultra cautious like this, they're saying, well, maybe we should not let anybody visit him while he's living at the Temple Mount for that 1 week before Yom Kippur, because it's possible that when somebody is visiting him, they have a heart attack, they die, now he's in the same room with a dead body, right? And you don't have to actually touch a dead body to become tameh with corpse tuma, because there's if you share a tent with a dead body, in other words, if you're under a roof with a dead body, you're in the same room with a dead body, you become tameh. And that requires a 7-day purification. And if it happens during the 7 days that he's sequestered, well, he's not going to be able to have a full 7 days and then immerse and then serve on Yom Kippur. So maybe they shouldn't let him have any guests. That's what's being suggested now. And Rav Tachlifa, the father of Rav Huna bar Tachlifa, said in the name of Rava, that is to say, that impurity imparted by a corpse is permitted in cases involving the public. In cases where the public is involved, impurity imparted by a corpse does not prevent the temple service from being conducted. Since the service of the high priest on Yom Kippur is a service involving communal offerings, impurity imparted by a corpse does not invalidate the service. So now what's being said is, well, actually, in terms of corpse tuma, it wouldn't matter if he became tameh during that 1 week, and then he wouldn't have enough time to go through a whole purification process prior to Yom Kippur, because in terms of corpse tuma, even if he became tameh, that would only stop him from bringing private offerings. But with respect to communal offerings, we either it's permitted or it's overridden. Right, so this is the idea, and where do we get this? With the laws of Passover, and there's a second Passover for people who were tameh from corpse tuma because they were bearing a body, and so they're not allowed to bring their Passover offering. Again, only when the temple is standing is all of this relevant. And so there's a second chance for them to bring the Passover offering a month later. But this is the law of an individual. And we have already seen that if the majority of the nation is tameh, if most people are in a state of tuma, like there was a war and everyone was involved and there were a lot of dead bodies everywhere and they were burying dead bodies, there was a battle, etc., something like that, they would still bring the Passover offerings on Passover itself, because individual offerings are put off to the second Passover, but communal offerings are not. So then now with this general principle that in terms of ritual impurity imparted by a corpse, when it comes to communal offerings, it doesn't matter if the priest is tameh, is ritually impure. Ravina said, even if you say that tuma imparted by a corpse is merely overridden in public, so there's a difference between permitted and overrides, right? So if in terms of these, the fact that you can bring communal offerings even if the priest is tameh, are we saying that because it's a communal offering involved, it doesn't matter that he's tameh, it's just permitted? Or are we saying that, well, it's allowed to do it, but it's definitely suboptimal, right? We would rather not override the laws of tuma if there's an alternative. So in terms of ordinary priests, if it's an ordinary priest bringing a communal offering and he is tameh, it might be okay legally to do it, but if we can find a priest that is tahor, ritually pure, we would rather do that. But since there's only one high priest, and now there's a chance that he could become tameh, would we allow him to, he would just bring the communal offering. So maybe that's why it doesn't matter that they allow people to visit him, even though there's a slight possibility that somebody could die in his presence, and then he would be tameh by virtue of a corpse, tumas ames. But Ravina says, even if you said that tuma imparted by a corpse is merely overridden in public and not completely permitted, the idea that the high priest is not removed from the potential of tuma imparted by a corpse can still be understood, because impurity imparted by a corpse is not common, right? It's not common that he would receive visitors during his 1 week that he's sequestered on the Temple Mount and somebody would drop dead. And we're not going to issue rabbinic decrees that are going to have effect on the Temple Mount, where the sages were very reticent to issue any kind of ordinances, right? We've seen that the rabbinic decrees generally don't apply in the Temple Mount because the priests themselves can be trusted to handle the matters of the temple. So they don't want to impose this law that no visitors, on the off chance that somebody might die while he's visiting the guy. I mean, maybe he starts get really ill. They can get him out of the room before he actually dies in the same room with the high priest. So we're not going to create a law like that. Well, there is an Amoraic dispute, a dispute among Amoraim, rabbis of the Gemara period, with regard to the effect of corpse tuma on the conduct of the temple service. It was stated with regard to corpse tuma that Rav Nachman said, it is permitted in cases involving the public. In other words, when a majority of the Jewish people are impure, the service of a ritually pure priest is not preferable to that of an impure priest. And the temple service proceeds as though there was no impurity at all. And Rav Sheshes said, impurity imparted by a corpse is merely overridden in cases involving the public, and the service performed by a ritually pure priest is preferable. And the Gemara restricts the scope of the dispute. In a case where there are both ritually impure and pure, right, tameh and tahor priests in the same group of priests that are serving in the temple in a particular week, and on that day, everyone, even Rav Nachman, agrees that the pure priests serve and the impure priests do not serve. So if you've got an option, you've got priests that are ritually pure available. So even though the nation is impure, and it might not matter whether the priest is impure, but if you've got a pure priest available, we put him forward and he replaces the priest that became tameh. Where they disagree is with regard to a case where all the priests that are serving in the Temple Mount on a given day are tameh. And the question is it necessary to seek out and bring tahor priests from a different family that's not serving that week? belonging to the same priestly watch who are tasked with serving the temple on a different day that week. And Rav Nachman said, the prohibition against performing the temple service in a state of impurity imparted by a corpse is permitted in cases involving the public, and we do not need to seek out other priests. Since the Torah permitted the performance of the temple service by priests impure with an impurity imparted by a corpse, it is completely permitted, and it is as though the service is performed in purity. Rav Sheshes said the prohibition of impurity imparted by a corpse is overridden in cases involving the public, and wherever possible, we seek out ritually pure priests. Some say that the dispute is slightly different, even in a case where there are both ritually pure and ritually impure priests in the same patrilineal family that are serving at a given time. Rav Nachman disagreed with Rav Sheshes and said that the priests serve even when they are impure, as in all situations of impurity imparted by corpses in cases involving the public, the merciful one permits those who are impure to perform the temple service. That's it. That's the whole page. We did the whole daf instead of, kind of like skipping around a little bit as we usually do. So, it's definitely a little bit technical here and there, but you got the whole flow of how they handled the argument in the question that was presented tonight. So I'm coming to your questions and comments now. I didn't give the warning that I'm about to be done, so I'll just quickly mention that I was much struck today, and we had a double Torah portion this past week, Tazria Mitzorah, and so the Haftorah, normally, each Torah portion has, after we read the portion in synagogue on a Saturday, then we also do something called a Haftorah, which is a reading from the rest of the, a little portion from the rest of the Hebrew Bible, either from the writings or the prophets. When you have a double portion, you don't read both Haftorahs that are associated with that week's, with the double Torah portion. So the one that we didn't read today is a story that is just worth mentioning. And it happened during this time in the ancient kingdom of Israel, that there was a man who was not Jewish and not from Israel, right? So he was a mighty general from another country, from Aram. And he became a Metzorah. He became a leper, right? He was stricken with Saraas. And then the commentary that I read is because he had a slave, he had taken a Hebrew slave and was very abusive toward her. And that's why he was stricken with Saraas. And so his skin was breaking out all over the place. He didn't know how to heal it. And the slave girl told this general's wife that, well, there's a prophet in Israel. I'm reasonably sure it was Elisha, not Elijah, but I just want to double check that. It was Elisha, right? Almost sure that it was Elisha. I just want to confirm so I don't misspeak. Yeah, so this was a story from second book of Kings, chapter 4. Yes, exactly. So this slave girl said to him, well, there's a prophet in Israel. Elisha was the student of Elijah and succeeded him as the prophet of Israel after Elijah, ascended to heaven without dying. At any rate, she said, if you want to be healed of this disease, you have to go and see the prophet in Israel. So this mighty general from another country goes to his king and he says, look at me. I'm a mess. My skin is breaking out all over the place. I can't function as your general. I can't fight battles. And apparently the only one who can heal me is this prophet Elisha in Israel. Let me go see him. So the king says, all right, I will write you a letter of introduction to the king of Israel so that he takes care of you. So Elisha, bearing with an entourage, his big entourage because he's a mighty general, and carrying tribute, meaning treasure, and this letter from his king to the king of Israel arrives. The king of Israel reads this letter and he rends his garments, tears his garments, meaning he's devastated. Why is the king of Israel devastated? Because he thinks, what can I do for this guy? I can't guarantee that the prophet is going to cure him. this is a pretext, right? The king of Aram, what he really wants is to attack Israel. Because if I can't cure his general, and God forbid the general dies of this disease, then I'm going to be blamed for it, and they're going to come and attack me. So the king is devastated. But Elisha, because he's a prophet and he knows things, hears that the king is so devastated, and he says, it's okay. Send this general to me. Now, the other reason that the king was hesitant to even deal with Elisha is because this was a wicked king who had himself engaged in idolatrous practices within Israel. So, his relations with Elisha were not good. But Elisha said, send the general to me. The general and his entourage and the wagons full of treasure come to see Elisha, come to see the prophet. The prophet will not even answer the door for this general. He sends his messenger to talk to the general and says to him, tell the general that what he needs to do to be cured of this tsaras, of this skin condition, is to go to the Jordan River and immerse 7 times. Go in and out, bathe in the Jordan River, take off all his clothes, be fully submerged in the river, get out, and repeat 7 times. And then he'll be cured. The general is furious. He expected that the prophet would come out and beseech God and pray and maybe, put him through all kinds of weird practices and like some immense ritual. But if the cure for this condition is just a natural cure to immerse in a river 7 times, he had to come all the way to Israel for that. And he says, do we not have better rivers in my own country? Mighty, bigger, deeper, cleaner, richer rivers than whatever little picayune river you have here in Israel? And he's just so angry. And then luckily his servants, right, his assistants, his adjutants, say to the general, now wait a minute. If the prophet had come out here and said to you that in order to be cured, you have to do something very difficult, imagine like, a painful cure or eating a bunch of stuff or, climbing a mountain or afflicting himself or prostrating himself or something that would have been really, really difficult to do, would you not have done it? Yeah. So now that he told you something simple, why don't you just try it? What could it hurt? So he says, what could it hurt? So he goes to the Jordan River and he immerses 7 times and he comes out and his skin is shining and pure and healed and the whole malady is gone. He goes back to the prophet and he says, now I know that there is no God but the God of Israel. I apologize for my behavior before. Please take this whole treasure that I brought. The prophet says, I know that treasure, at least some of it has been used for idolatrous practices. I don't want any of it. The general says, listen, I want you to know that I'm fully converted now. I will only worship the God of Israel. But when I go back and my king, who's thoroughly immersed in idolatry, he goes to this big thing once a year where he bows to his statue. And I, as his lead general, have to accompany him, and he holds my hand, and we have to bow together in front of the nation. I'm not going to be able to get out of that, lest I, be executed. So I just am telling you that when I bow alongside my king, I won't be bowing to the idol. I'm just going to be preserving my life. I won't mean it. I apologize in advance. And the prophet said, go in peace. So that was the story. And I think it's worth repeating that story because sometimes, plenty of things in life are difficult and we dread them because they're difficult. But sometimes the solution to our problems is right before us. It's simple and we don't want to accept it because it seems too simple. So maybe the lesson from that story is, listen, if you hear it from a good source, somebody who's a person of great faith, and they tell you that your life can turn around if you just do some simple things and turn your heart to God, so maybe it's worth listening to. Okay, now let's go to comments and questions from today. Bill says, do the whole daf feels like a euphemism akin to using a little elbow grease. Fair enough. And Alan Kaufman, why did the Cohen separate from his wife? Must have been something traumatic? Oh, I think it's a good joke. Traumatic. Okay. All right, so we got the answer to that. That's what I've got for us tonight. Thanks so much for listening, everybody, and to Sharon for dedicating today's show. With God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow. Not tomorrow, again, as I mentioned, Monday night. No show tomorrow, but I'll see you with God's help Monday night, the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific, and we'll do, again, with God's help, a double page, pages 7 and 8. Have a good night. Oh, Nina's just quickly slipping me a final question. Lynn in Texas, I always wondered how this man could get Tzara'at, though not living in Israel nor being Jewish, yet he was and became an unusual God-fearer, and he had this Israelite servant. Very odd. Thanks, right? Because the laws of Tzara'as apply to Jews. They don't apply to non-Jews, and yet here was a non-Jew who had this condition, but it served to, bring him closer to God. So, something to be learned there. I don't have a good answer. Is it exclusively something that happens to Jews? Clearly not. Here we have a story that not. So under certain conditions, it could happen to non-Jews as well. Again, this was a malady from the ancient world. Another question, which I don't remember the answer, is after Mashiach comes, right, and the resurrection of the dead, etc., and the temple will be restored. Will there be tzara'as in that time? Once the temple is back and we have the possibility of being purified from tzara'as, and we can't have tzara'as, we can't be impure when we enter the temple grounds, will tzara'as return as well? Or maybe it won't be necessary because we'll all be living at such an elevated holy state that we wouldn't think of gossiping. I'm not sure what the answer to that question is offhand. Have a great night.